Well, thanks a lot, and thanks for inviting me. I saw your list of speakers. It was very impressive. I'm honored to join you. And yes, the first elections class I taught was the 1980 Reagan Carter election. It was before actually I arrived here. I started at E-Town at 82. So I'm still going full time. I spent a lot of time in administration, but hanging in there. I'm hoping to latch on. Um, a lot of good enthusiasm in the class, by the way. I have 30 students and I think they're having fun. Well, let me get started. I have an overview. I have kind of an approach to what happened uh, this past week and during the campaign, but I really hope to leave lots of time for you to have for questions because I know you have them. Let me share this with you. All right, can you see that all right?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Very good. And you can hear me okay?
Indeed.
All right, thanks. All right, so what happened? Well, we're still trying to figure that out because there's still votes remaining to be counted. But well, as of yesterday, as we know, Joe Biden's the president-elect. He may have as few as 279 electoral votes and as many as 321 if North Carolina comes through. He may actually have a majority of closer to 6 million. California is still out there with about a quarter of the vote to go, and he carried California by 4 million. So there's probably another million votes there. But a pretty solid, convincing majority. This looks pretty much like the second Obama election against Romney, that kind of spread. Republicans, as you no doubt know, are the favorite to retain their majority. There are 2 seats in Georgia. There'll be runoffs. North Carolina is still in play, and Alaska, they, well, I guess they're still flying in votes from all over that place. They not really quick in counting. So right now it looks like those are all Republican seats, and I think in all 4 of those cases the Republicans are favored. But there is that possibility that Democrats could have a 50-50 split with Kamala Harris breaking the tie, but we have to wait till January. The House elections were disappointing. Democrats expected to pick up seats. They're down the net. It was a big night for incumbency. If you were an incumbent member of Congress, it was highly likely you were reelected, and that was true in Pennsylvania. Democrats were also disappointed statewide. Attorney General Shapiro survived, but it looks like the Auditor General and Treasurer will be Republicans, and Democrats really didn't make any progress in gaining on the Republican majority in the state legislature. This is amazing. The turnout, approximating 160 million votes, about 2/3 of eligible voters. A modern record. You have to go back like to 1900 when only white men basically could vote. Here are the maps, which by now you've memorized and you're familiar with. This is a 2016 map, and as you know, Trump was able to carry the Great Lakes states plus Florida. And the map this time around is not much different, except that Biden carried the Great Lakes states and very possibly Georgia and Arizona. I love this map. This is from Obama 2012 to the Trump Clinton election, and this is by county. Counties that moved from Obama to Trump are in the red, or at least where there was movement in that direction. And the blue counties are those that move from Romney to Clinton. And you can see obviously where Trump made up all that ground. Pretty amazing. Now we look ahead from the New York Times. It's kind of scattered, and we'll probably get a better graph later, but you can see Still movement, especially in rural areas toward Trump, even Western Pennsylvania, but a lot of movement toward toward Biden. Obviously, the eastern part of the state, suburban and urban areas, especially. Sorry about that. You see in the urban areas, suburban areas in Texas, Colorado. So kind of a mixed bag because both candidates picked up votes. I mean, Trump improved tremendously in terms of the total vote, and in some states was able to increase his majorities. On the whole, though, Biden did better than Clinton really across the board. Even in Lancaster County, at the latest count, I saw that Trump had beaten Hillary by about 47,000 votes. And right now, the margin is about 44,000. And that's kind of indicative of how Biden had improved on Hillary Clinton over 4 years. Well, here's my approach, and it's kind of a standard political science-y type approach that when an incumbent president is running, really the sort of the overall overarching issue is change versus the status quo. Elections tend to be referenda on the performance of the incumbent president and party. And so there are a number of indicators of how happy people are with the current administration. And this is kind of a somewhat counterintuitive because we've just spent about $14 billion on the campaign. But, you know, the sort of the general political science approach is that campaigns don't really matter that much. That it's the larger context that matters and shapes voter opinions. And, you know, I'll explain why here shortly. But here are some, and obviously in a close race, campaign activities and events can make a difference. You know, obviously the incumbent has powers. I apologize for some of the really heavy text here. Some of these come from my classes. I sort of treat these as lecture notes. But in any case, if you're an incumbent president, chances are pretty good you're going to win re-election. Although recent incumbents won by narrower margins. As you all know, it's the Electoral College that matters. And this will now be what, out of the last eight elections, Democrats have won the popular vote in 7 of them, which is a record. In terms of President Trump's use of incumbency, well, just looking at his official acts as president, I think he had a real opportunity to deal forcefully with the pandemic, but he punted. And he continued to sort of justify his approach. And even while we're now in another wave or the continuance of the first wave of COVID, he was telling us that we're turning a corner. The Barrett nomination, I think at the last minute, it's highly controversial to say the least, but he was able to say that he was able to deliver on that promise. Of course, we know things that he did during the campaign, changing the naming a new postmaster general and various ways in which he tried to, well, I guess, shape things his way. One of the big indications about whether people are happy or unhappy with an incumbent is when they're asked whether the country is going on the right track or wrong track. Of course, consistently, as you can see, we haven't been on the right track for a long time, if you believe this poll. This is the Real Clear Politics average. But, you know, relatively speaking, entering 2020 before the pandemic, there was a fairly reasonable but manageable margin between wrong track and right track. But after the pandemic hit, as you can see, the two tracks really started to diverge, and that's not a good place for an incumbent to be. We asked people whether they're better off or worse off in terms of their personal finances. During the Trump years, people have said, of course, this is a continuation of the Obama economy, but nevertheless, people tended to think they were better off financially than they were. However, of course, during this age of COVID, people have been doing worse off, and it's been going back and forth. The exit polls that were taken on election day, which was a combination of asking people as they left the polls and surveying all those people who voted by mail or who voted early. 41% of people said they were better off financially than they were 4 years ago, and they were Trump voters. Everybody else were Biden voters. So once again, kind of a mixed picture, but certainly you would rather be Biden than Trump. Job approval, and this is probably the most important statistic because the final margin is really going to very closely reflect of the actual vote is really going to reflect approval ratings. And you can see that this is during both presidents, both Obama and Trump. This was the Obama job approval, which started high and then dropped, as is usually the case with presidents, then went kind of up and down, and then toward the end started to rise. Now, of course, he was coming out of the Great Recession. Trump, one of the remarkable things about Trump's popularity is that it has been just stable. It started low, has remained the same way, started to rise, and just before the pandemic hit, he was approaching 50%, and then, of course, dropped precipitously. But by the time of this election, by earlier this week, it had risen to 47 again, almost as if the pandemic had never happened, or we treated it as if it were kind of a passing event. It'll come and go. So people kind of reverted, it seemed, to their opinion of Trump before COVID. His unfavorables were in the negative, Biden's were in the positive. So, here is, historically low approval, which is not good. Most all of these indicators indicated that Trump was in big trouble, but that was mainly because of the effects of the pandemic. Job approval, by the way, has become polarized as everything else has in this country. If you go back to the 50s and 60s, generally speaking, Republicans like their president, think he's doing a great job. Here's Reagan. There's my arrow. And Democrats thought he did a terrible job. You can see, beginning with Reagan, it's when you get this really large spread, partisan spread and approval. Same spread with Clinton, W, Obama, and Trump's was even largest. So he, during this whole presidency, has been able to maintain the support of his base, and the Democrats really have had a very low opinion of him, and this is reflected in the vote. There was slightly more Democrats who voted last week or during this election than Republicans. Democrats hated him and Republicans loved him. And then the other big indicator of incumbent performance is the economy. You can see that relatively slow but positive growth during the Obama and into the Trump years, during this greatest economy, he says, that he produced. And but then we had the first 2 quarters of this year, record lows, and then a very sharp jump in GDP over this last quarter. That was reported in the last couple of weeks. But so that was one of the big questions. How long are people's memories? If they have very short memories, and there's a school of thought that says that voters do, they might have thought that Trump had put us back on the path to prosperity. But if they just go back a few months, then they might be very pessimistic. So anyway, that's sort of the overview, which indicated that Trump entering this election was in big trouble. The conventional wisdom is that campaigns do matter, but it requires certain things, that voters pay attention to the campaign. Not all of them do. Some wait till very late. according to this model, it's basically persuasion and activation of your base. We know that there weren't very many uncertain voters. It's hard for me to believe that there was an undecided voter in this last month. If you didn't have an opinion about Trump, then you were off on another planet. But let me give you some campaign factors here, and then we'll open it up. The issues, according to the exit polls, Republicans prioritize the economy. Democrats here are Democratic voters. What issues were very important to you? Democrats put containing COVID number one. Republicans put economic recovery as their number one. Of course, Democrats just had a lot of issues. And even in politics, they have a lot of issues. But unifying the country, healthcare, also the recovery, of course, racial inequality. In the national exit poll, the number two issue next to the economy that showed up was racial inequality, which I thought was remarkable. Now, of course, most of it were Democrats and maybe people of color, but still. Climate change. So Democrats had a lot of important issues going in. Republicans tended to focus on the recovery, terrorism, crime. Overall, the number one issue, according to the exit polls, was the economy. And surprisingly, voters were evenly split on how the fight against coronavirus was going. I don't know about you. I don't think it's going very well, but the country's about evenly split on that. I took a look at that on election night and said, the pandemic may not be as big an issue as the Democrats would like it to be. What were people looking for in a president? Of course, they look for everything, but those who wanted a strong leader basically were Trump voters. Biden voters valued good judgment more, honesty more. They wanted a uniter. The number one trait in the national exit poll was strong leadership. So, Biden had the bulk of the issues, had most of the characteristics that people wanted to see from a president, but Trump had a hold of the number one issue, the economy, and the number one candidate trait, strong leader. There was a question about cares about people like me, and that turned out to be not so much a caring trait, but more of a selfishness trait, evenly split. I mean, Trump voters said that Trump cares about me, and Biden voters said, my guy cares about me, and that was pretty much of a standoff. Looking at the campaign, Biden outspent Trump by a lot. He ran more TV ads, but Trump dominated social media. Of course, he did a lot of travel. He received more national and local media coverage. This is cable news, your CNN, CNBC, Fox News. And you can see, of course, this goes back to 2019. You would expect an incumbent president, and especially someone as attention-seeking as Trump, to dominate the airwaves, which he did. And this continued into the campaign, but the margin narrowed. But Trump was always received more coverage. Of course, not all coverage is good coverage. This is selective. This is my favorite photo, by the way. This is when he returned home from the Tulsa rally and looked like a beaten man. But this is selective, but these were some of the media events, and most of them were not very positive for Trump. I guess his fans liked it, but you'll recall the protest outside the White House, and he went over to I guess it was the Episcopalian Church and held a Bible. The Tulsa rally was a disaster. Various other things which happened during the campaign. Of course, the death of Justice Ginsburg and the appointment of Judge Barrett was extremely important. The debates, Trump was roundly castigated for his performance in the first debate. If the debates had any impact at all. So, and then, these things I think tend to cancel each other out, because Fox News says he does great, and the mainstream media said he does terrible, and nobody's opinion changes. Well, the wrap up, let's look at group voting. And there was a gender gap. Men were evenly split. Now, most of these categories are going to favor Biden because he's winning the popular vote by a large margin. So the best Trump is doing in a lot of these categories is simply splitting. But you'll see Biden has an edge in a lot of these categories. So men split between the two candidates, but Biden was the favorite of women. Trump did well with white folk. People of color went for Biden, and really, there was a lot of talk about Trump making inroads with blacks and Latinos, and certainly that was the case in Florida. But generally speaking, these are pretty much what Democratic candidates do among blacks, Latinos, Asians. Young people under 45 liked Biden. The other two groups over 45 like Trump or were split. I do have a bone to pick with, I guess, many of you and me. Trump carried the elderly vote, the over 65 vote, by 10 points 4 years ago. And then all the polls were saying that the older folk were unhappy with how cavalier Trump was with the pandemic. And they were saying that Biden would carry the over 65 vote by 10 points or more. And obviously it did not turn out to be the case. So, I hate to accuse anyone of lying around here, but, it's, I don't think younger people would be, out of line if they, didn't trust much of what you said. They might ask a couple extra questions at Thanksgiving. College graduates went for Trump, went for Biden, of course. Generally speaking, though, there were more women, so, Biden group, more whites, although the white vote was down from 4 years ago. 45% of the electorate was a college graduate. That's overrepresenting that group. As I said, very few undecided people. There appeared to be a big break for Trump in the last week, which actually that's unusual for an incumbent. If people are undecided about an incumbent, they generally are going to break against him at the end, and that's not what happened. So we can talk about what happened during the last week or two. As I mentioned, he improved with his base, but Biden won the lion's share of new voters. And when you look at the swing groups that go either way, Biden, and these are all groups that Hillary lost 4 years ago, but Biden won independents, moderates, suburbanites, and Catholics evenly split. So to conclude, and I'm very anxious to hear your questions and comments. Even if campaigns do not decide elections, they're important for the process of governing. We can learn about how a candidate will manage or run the White House from the way they run the campaign. People who advise the candidate may become important advisors. Of course, there are a lot of Obama alumni. It's only 4 years ago that Biden will have to choose from. He's looking for people to run the government. The relationship between the campaign and the party may reflect the relationship between the president and the party and Congress. So probably we would expect, well, I'll leave that question up to you. And of course, the promises that candidates make may become their agenda as president. And contrary to popular belief, most presidents try to fulfill their promises. And the more substantive the campaign, the more the candidate can say, I have a mandate to do X, Y, and Z. And of course, Biden has a very ambitious agenda beginning with the pandemic, and then sort of a green jobs and infrastructure program, and healthcare and climate change, things like minimum wage and family leave, and on down. Who knows, of course, if government is divided, how much, if any, of that he'll be able to deliver. So that is my show. And I'm very happy to hear any of your questions and comments. Thank you.
Fletcher, thank you so much for taking the time to kind of walk us through a little bit of a history there, as well as providing some good statistics for us to consider, just some of the information about the most recent election. I have a question to maybe kick us off here. A lot of people had been talking about this blue wave that might happen throughout the election. I think it's clear now that despite the large advantage in the popular vote for the president, there wasn't a lot of change that happened within for House seats, as well as in local, state. I don't think any state legislatures flipped, and so I guess one of my questions is, how is it often, and I know that this is usually election and candidate specific, but can you say anything about how split ticket voting sometimes happens, where individuals may choose to elect a president, but choose a different party for a local representative? And I'll note that you made the point at the beginning that Shapiro is retaining his seat, but some other seats within this state were not. And what could account for that kind of decision? Do people prefer divided government for some reason or another, or what? What do you think?
Yeah, no, thanks. Well, generally speaking, the pattern has been the last decade or longer for people to vote straight party. And, but, at the margins, there'll be ticket splitting. And when the electorate is as close as this one, the relatively small percentage that split their ticket, can make a difference. And we saw what happened, for example, and Wisconsin. I have a theory on Pennsylvania. As many of you know, there was a deal a year ago, a law passed that enabled us to vote by mail more easily, without excuses, and more opportunities to vote early with drop boxes or going to your courthouse. But in exchange for that, which is what the Democrats wanted, the Republicans wanted to take out that one box that you can check to vote a straight party. And you'd have to, as you know, you had to go right down the ballot from president to attorney general to state senator to state representative. I guess my theory is that Trump people, and maybe Republicans generally, were more intense, more enthusiastic, more likely to vote straight party all the way down the line than Democrats, who focused really, like laser focused on the top of the ticket, basically wanted to get rid of Trump and didn't, bother to check the remaining boxes. And, there were a number of people who sort of feared that that would happen, or that the low information voters, to the extent that they're disproportionately Democratic, would be less likely to vote a straight party. So I think that did handicap the Democrats in the statewide races across the board. So that's my Pennsylvania-centric theory. But generally, the presidency is the most visible office, obviously, the most visible campaign. But normally people will vote with their party and they will vote for the incumbent. And as I mentioned, it was a really good night for incumbents, other than Trump. Sir, you are,
Yeah, John, it looks like you're muted there.
yeah, you're muted.
Okay, am I unmuted now?
Yes, you are.
Yes, you are.
Okay. I was curious about what you have to think about the people that Biden will gather around him, the people that will have his ear. Obviously, the country isn't as far left as a lot of the Bernie Sanders and other people that were running, but there's concern from people more central or middle of the road where things can actually happen in terms of legislation and getting things done, on who will have his ear and where will his agenda go.
Right. Okay. But I think, as I mentioned, I think there are a number of, first of all, he's going to, this is kind of the return of the, or revenge of the establishment. We're going to see familiar figures. We're going to see experienced figures. Of course, Biden made a point to say, I'm going to listen to scientists and professionals, career civil servants. So we're going to see, there'll be some new faces, but in terms of the actual running of the government at the staff level, cabinet, sub-cabinet level, you'll see a lot of experience surrounding Biden. Now, that said, I think there will be some new faces. He has a very broad coalition that, as you suggested, moderates, conservatives, former never Trump Republicans, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez type progressives. So I'm sure he'll try to make an effort to place some people at a whole range of people around him. There were some stars who emerged during this campaign or during this past year. Pete Buttigieg, the South Bend mayor, Stacey Abrams, the Georgia organizer, former House leader. And, so I expect to see some of them, but I think he'll probably take, and I'm not, he'll probably take kind of the team of rivals approach. I'm very curious to see who you'll appoint as Attorney General. I think there are large, there's a wider range of candidates for that. Treasury Secretary, Secretary of State. Some of this, of course, Republicans would have to confirm, all these major appointments if they control the Senate. So he may have to compromise, but I would think it'll be a broad range of opinions with the emphasis on experience and expertise.
One of the questions that's in the chat is what you think the influence of the pandemic was. I know you had mentioned some of the approval ratings. Do you think that played a substantial role, and that without the pandemic, it's possible that the president would have been reelected?
He was in good shape. You'll recall he had beaten impeachment in February, and he was, pretty full of himself. It's when he had the State of the Union address and gave the Medal of Freedom to Rush Limbaugh, and so he didn't seem to care about what anybody felt about that. And even now, people think that he's a better manager of the economy. So he had that riding for him, and regardless of his exaggerated comments about how he created this great economy, it was going very well, and then things collapsed. And I think obviously the collapse of the economy, and we only have gotten even though things have gotten better, we only about half of those jobs have been recovered. But secondly, more importantly, this was a failure of leadership. And I think there were a lot of Trump folk, say 2016 Trump folk, who were very dismayed, at his unserious attitude toward the pandemic, cavalier, even I don't know, and they really had their doubts. But I do think many of them kind of came back at the very end, whether they were fearful of Democratic control, maybe wanted divided government, as John suggested, whether it's pandemic fatigue, whether the improvement of the economy, the Barrett nomination, his manic, frantic campaigning in the last couple of weeks. There was a surge toward him, at the end. And it was almost as if, and part of it's also wishful thinking. He's saying, well, it's, the vaccine is just around the corner. We're turning the corner. All evidence to the contrary, including him and his White House, which is, kind of a hot spot. But I think people wanted, just to hear that things, one things returned back to the way they were. And he was, and that may have been persuasive. But
There's some.
I was surprised at the polls, though, indicating that people were not as concerned about the pandemic, at least now, as they might have been earlier. And, of course, you might have seen, ironically, the states that almost all the states that are experiencing an early spike now in the Midwest and the Plain states, almost all of them went for Trump. So people, chose to ignore it.
I have a couple, another question in the comments, but before I do that, I want to go to, I think Ken Crater has a question, and I think I saw Rich Nornhold with a question too. So Ken, do you want to go ahead?
Concerning the polls, Fletcher, is it possible that people were just too embarrassed to really tell a faceless person on the phone that they were voting for Trump?
Well, that's one of the, that's something the pollsters are going to have to examine, and they missed it again, 2 elections in a row. Now, they do pretty well when Trump is not on the ballot, but when Trump is involved, they seem to really miss it and really underestimate his support. Now, is it because of social desirability? There are people who don't want to admit to other people that they're supporting Trump for fear that they will be, people think of them as racist or sexist. That might have been a factor in 2016, but I don't know. I don't see very many shy Trump supporters now. Do you? I mean, flags and banners and paraphernalia, a whole Trump industry is out there. People seem to be very proud of their support. So I don't think that's it.
Would it be the other way around?
I do think that Trump supporters are probably less likely to respond to pollsters. I think, they're so distrusting of anything that smacks of any connection to the media. It may be that Trump supporters wanted to, mess around and not be totally forthcoming about their support. I mentioned this in the LNP today, which is available to you online or at popular prices, that it's pollsters are having a hard time generally, and just getting samples of people. They've had trouble getting minority communities, but I think Trump and the enthusiasm of his support is really hard to gauge. And I think that really sort of helped carry Republican candidates. Because once again, even though Trump lost, he did increase his turnout and support. So it's very ironic or very unusual for a losing candidate to have that kind of pull. At any rate, it's good to see you, Ken and Carol. And sorry I missed you, about a few weeks ago at a lecture.
I have another question here, and then after this one, I'm going to go to Rich Nornhold, who I believe has a question. A question from the chat is about just moving forward. Do you envision Trump? How successful do you envision this this attempt in the courts to be? Is there any chance that it will actually overturn the results? And then maybe more to the point, as a lame duck, what do you anticipate? I know this is always a difficult question, but what do you anticipate he may end up doing through following through on his threat? Let me get this threat to bring about scorched earth policy before exiting the White House.
Yeah, wow. I don't give the lawsuits much chance. I mean, believe me, people are looking for evidence of fraud, but I don't think they're finding it, and it hasn't, studies show that there isn't any, or very little. Trump himself appointed a commission to find fraud 4 years ago, and they couldn't find any. So on that basis, I don't think these suits have a chance. Now, I think like a Clarence Thomas or a Brett Kavanaugh would, if the Trump lawyers just threw up a ham sandwich or something, they would vote to throw out all Democratic votes. But I don't think they would want to touch this with a 10-foot pole. We're just not talking about the same circumstances as with Bush and Gore, where he had a very narrow election. And boy, what is he going to do? Well, he's already at work purging, I think, people that he think weren't sufficiently supportive. And he's already at work firing people left and right. Now, what more he could do? Well, he's president. He could do a lot. I don't think he's in any frame of mind to be making any decisions. He's purged anybody who has, any sense of reason around him. But the one interesting thing we saw, right, over the last couple of days, is the media are now not as hesitant to turn him off. The big thing is Republicans, and you folks probably know, this better than I do, but, still there are very few that want to challenge him. And if we ever get, sort of a wave of Republicans who are currently in office, not the ones who are gone, to say this is enough, then, I think it bodes well for at least a normal or more normal transition. But, the media, I think, are offering more resistance. The momentum now is all, the election's over. Please, step down. Please get out of the way. Please concede. I don't think I'll listen to any of that stuff. But still, I think, I mean, we're in for a rocky 2 months here.
As a political outsider, I suspect that some of the connections and loyalty that Donald Trump made over the last couple of years weren't based on long-term relationships that he held with people. And so perhaps we'll see, people more likely to flee as that ship goes down, but that remains to be seen.
Yeah.
Rich Nornhold, did you have a question? Rich, are you there? It sounds like you're clicking frantically. It might not be working. So let me move on to a quick question here. There's some concern that during this election season, there's a large portion of the population that has, quote unquote, become disconnected from the facts. Do you see any hope in this trend changing moving forward? Are you optimistic?
Well, I think the media bubble is actually going to, harden. I mean, sometimes even Fox News has been somewhat uncomfortable reporting on Trump's shenanigans. But with him out of the way, they're going to be very free to say anything that they want about what Biden and the Democrats are up to. And so I don't think, at least on that side of it, that things are going to change very much. I mean, Trump may be gone, but there still is Trumpism, and there are folks out there who want to present themselves as the next Trump, only a little bit saner.
Right.
And so I'm not hopeful on that front. On the other hand, I mean, I think Biden is a traditional politician, and has understood the way our relationships with our allies work, understand the traditional notion of how government works. He's going to emphasize and hold up those people with expert knowledge, and he'll see to it, that those views prevail. Will rejoin Paris, will rejoin the World Health Organization. The first job number one is the pandemic. So at least, on the policy level, and hopefully this will filter down, we might see an improvement there.
Richard's microphone wasn't working, so he entered his question in the chat, which is basically, what questions have each of the respective parties learned after this election? No shift in control in the Senate. So what happens to, well, potentially, but what happens to the GOP in terms of a potential split within their own party? Do they become this party of Trump, or will they move on? And then same question for the Democrats. As Biden has to work with a larger coalition, will he live in the expectations of the AOC wing of the Democratic Party in 4 years, or will he work more with moderates within the Senate?
Right. Well, first of all, I think we're talking about Mitch McConnell here, who is, the grim reaper for all things that come from Democrats. Now, he's also a pragmatist. I read that he may be interested in having another pandemic relief bill before Biden takes office, but I think that could happen. But I hesitate to think about Biden appointments, judges, things like that. Anything that could threaten Republican hegemony there. But I think McConnell will be able to have a unified Republican Senate behind him. The Democrats, Nancy Pelosi indicates she wants to run again for Speaker. We'll see if anyone challenges her. She did have a challenge 2 years ago. And we'll see how unhappy people are with the way the elections went. There were a number of, people who were in, very competitive districts who lost. A lot of hope for switches for Republicans who were in districts that voted for Hillary that didn't turn out. So there's going to be a power struggle. Now, I expect that she'll prevail because she's very crafty and also very effective. I mean, if Biden wants an agenda, it has all been laid out for him in, the dozens and dozens of bills that the House has passed the last couple of years that has been stuck in the Senate. So there it is. And it's really going to depend on whether Biden has the skill and maybe luck or something, but in order to bring enough Republicans in to break filibusters. So I think gridlock is kind of the order of the day. But so like some of the more ambitious things, like adding a public option to healthcare, things like that. I'm not sure about. I don't know about the Republican future. Right now, it still seems to be a Trumpist party. I don't see anyone out. I mean, even people that you would think were, somewhat independent-minded or inclined to be moderate sounding, like Nikki Haley. She's consumed the Kool-Aid. So I think, and of course there's Trump himself, and if he's not, in the slammer, he'll have some base, whether it's within the Fox empire or with, the whole, conservative media complex. He'll have a voice.
And could potentially run again.
And could run again. So I think, the Republicans are still in the grips of Trumpism.
Another question here is if you could speak into the role that LGBTQ issues or voters. Is there any polling, any information that you have on LGBTQ voters and how they may be broke in this election?
Yeah, they went about 3-1 or even 4-1, like 75% or 80% for Biden. Native Americans, you might have seen what they did, what the Navajo did in Arizona. They had 97% turnout. They generated like an 85,000, vote, plurality or a margin for Biden. And, they could claim that they basically delivered Arizona for Biden. So, but in any case, the LGBTQ community delivered for Biden, and so I think there will be an active agenda there. There's still the Equality Act that was passed by the House. Who knows what its fate will be in Congress? I expect that we're going to see a lot of executive action, right? There are going to be so many executive orders and administrative decisions put out to undo what Trump did. And of course, what Trump did was to undo what Obama did. So I'll go back and forth, but there's going to be a lot of time spent on that. That's going to be, like a one-term project to undo a lot of that. So in the absence of legislative action, there's going to be a lot of administrative action.
As we consider the political process moving forward, do you have anything to say about the amount of money and time that's committed to the election process? Would curtailing either of those things significantly change? I mean, it would significantly change the way we do elections, but is there any benefit to considering that?
Well, it's a lot of money. I mean, there was less than 10 billion spent in the election cycle 4 years ago. As I mentioned, we're talking about 14 billion. Citizens United, large corporations, rich folk with disproportionate influence. It's a huge issue. I think it's something that the Sanders campaign and more generally Democrats are interested in dealing with. I think there's got to be political reform. I mean, obviously, and starting with the vote, starting with elections. And, whether the changes that came about as a result of COVID will continue, or whether it's just sort of a one-time thing in terms of mail-in voting and more convenient. I hope that it will, those changes will stick. So the Democrats have a big agenda. In fact, our number one bill this past cycle was voting rights. So there is a lot of political reform to be done. I think the best we could get out of campaign finance, though, would be more disclosure. We have a lot of dark money circulating where you don't know how much and who donated it. I think that's the best we can hope for.
With the 2020 census that just took place, does that mean the electoral college will change for this next presidential cycle?
Yes, it will. And we'll lose at least one electoral vote in Pennsylvania. I don't know if we'll lose two.
Okay.
We'll lose at least one. And, it will shift mainly toward the Sun Belt. And of course, one of the positive things for the Democrats is how they have made real inroads. Florida was a disappointment, but Georgia, Arizona, Texas, North Carolina, Democrats are, have made some inroads there. So they may not suffer as much as one would think from the census. Another thing, of course, is redistricting, and there are more Republican-controlled chambers than Democratic-controlled. But Democrats generally are in a little better shape than they were 10 years ago. They're Democratic governors. They have made some progress in the last election cycle or two. but still, obviously the census influences redistricting.
Another question from the chat is, do you see a shift in dealing with white supremacy and systemic racism with this new administration?
Well, I think there'll be, very powerful messages from Biden and from Kamala Harris. Lots of movement activity still around this. I was surprised, by the way, looking at the exit polls. And I'm looking at the ones in the New York Times, so you guys can, can verify this. But I was actually kind of surprised and pleased. A number of questions asked about Black lives. I mentioned that racial inequality was a major issue, but positive polls on Black lives, on people saying that Blacks are unfairly treated by the criminal justice system. There is a criminal justice reform agenda, and we've seen some of it here in Pennsylvania, and some of it actually was enacted under Trump. I don't think even Washington politicians want to come back in 2 years totally empty-handed. So I think there actually will be, maybe possibly, and I may be kind of, totally wrong about this. I think there will be some positive work done around that issue, both administratively and even in Congress.
Fletcher, as always, we had slightly more questions in our chat than we were able to get to together. So apologies to those of you who had additional questions or comments. We've come to the conclusion of our time together. So once again, I just wanted to say thank you so much for your willingness to be with us this morning on what was a roller coaster of a week and pretty momentous occasion within the life of our country, as it always is every 4 years. And we're fortunate to have you be with us this morning to just provide some analysis for us and some answers to our questions. So thank you so much. Before we go, I would just offer you the opportunity to give us some parting words or anything that is on your mind about this election cycle, or as we think about politics in general moving forward, and then we'll close it out.
Well, God bless America. That's the first thing I'm going to say. Secondly, once again, thank you for having me. And what's most disappointing, right, is after this, we would go to the basement or something, and
Right. Yeah.
we'd have coffee and donuts, and we could
Virtual
continue.
handshakes and virtual coffee.
Yeah, that's disappointing. I was still thinking that everybody is congregated in a classroom, but obviously we're in a different age. But the one point I guess Obama made last week is, or when he was campaigning, is that just, it's going to be a little bit more, relaxing or less stress inducing. We're not going to be having to worry about what the president is doing every day and whether he's going to do something wacky. So I think we will get a little bit more control out of our lives, which I would recommend for anybody anyway. I think, I think even though there's always the risk, I think the transition will go relatively smoothly, especially because there was a convincing victory here. There's not much that, that I think opponents can, or the losers can raise. So we can, we can pray for that. And it is, it's a new day, a new administration, a new group of people, people who I think actually believe in things like truth. And if truth makes a comeback, then we're on the road to real progress.
Indeed. Hey, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Thank you to everyone for spending some time with us.
By the way, I see lots of familiar faces out there. It's really nice to see all of you.
Yeah. All right, everyone, take care, and we will see you later. Thanks, Fletcher.
Bye, y'all.